Hello, welcome to the first in what will hopefully be a series of videos attempting to break down some of the myths around the Rotary Foundation and make it a little easier to understand. This is aimed at members of Rotary in District 1060, which is the heart of England, which is Warwickshire, most of the West Midlands and bits of Worcestershire and Staffordshire thrown in for good measure. But it may appeal to those outside that area and even people outside Rotary itself. And if you are outside Rotary, please find out what it's all about. You might get a taste from this and see if you want to go further. So, without further ado, I will go on to the slides, which are the bulk of this. So, my name is Paul Beedham. I used to be the District Rotary Foundation Chairman. Did a 3-year stint, 2016 to 2019. If you want more up-to-date information, well, this slideshow should be quite up-to-date, but you need to go to the current District Foundation Chairman, who is Peter Ramage, doing the second of 3 years. So, good place to start, setting the scene. So back in 1917, the then Rotary International President, Arch Clumph, proposed an endowment for doing good in the world. Great idea, set things going, but it took a little while to become the Rotary Foundation. That was a good 11 years later in 1928, and didn't really take off in terms of donations and funding until Paul Harris, the founder of Rotary, died, and a telegram went out to all members around the world saying, please make donations to the Rotary Foundation in lieu of flowers. And of course that created a bit of a surge and built up the foundation in a big way. So the starting point, of course, the first donation was from the Rotary Club of Kansas, $27.50. These days, millions going in every year, and as we can see on this graph, we have a bit of a surge, the first real surge in the late 1980s, which of course is when Rotary decided to try and take on the massive task of eradicating polio from the world. And that was the first round of fundraising to satisfy that surge, that programme. Now, that 1947 burst of money, which came in over about 18 months, well over $1 million, created a need to develop a real programme. So the first programme of the Rotary Foundation was scholarships. So these guys, a sample of them, were studying in the academic year 1947-48 all around the world. So further education, in fact, graduate education was one of the big missions. Now, the interesting thing is these first people to go on Rotary scholarships were actually known as Paul Harris Fellows, which might be slightly confusing to those of us who are members of the organisation today. After Paul Harris Fellows, they became known as Ambassadorial Scholars, and more recently and currently Rotary Scholars. So same idea right from the beginning, the very first and probably the most successful programme that the Rotary Foundation has had. So the mission, well, the original objective, as we mentioned earlier, was doing good in the world. Great, but these days, of course, you need a proper mission statement, don't you? So the mission statement of the Rotary Foundation is to enable Rotarians to advance world understanding, goodwill and peace through the improvement of health, the support of education and the alleviation of poverty. Quite wide-ranging and covers most of the things we're likely to want to do good in the world, but focuses things a little. So, getting on to some mechanics of how it actually works. So, a tale of 4 funds. Well, the eagle-eyed among you may notice there are only 3 showing on that chart. We now have a 4th fund, the Disaster Response Fund, which kicked in the last Rotary year, so it's been going about 12-13 months now. Couldn't be more timely considering what we're dealing with at the moment in the world, but I'll touch on that in a minute. So what we have is the annual fund. Now, that's the main one that everybody will be donating into if you don't actually specify anything else. So it's sort of the default. It's the one that funds most of the programs we're dealing with, but say it's the standard one, if you like. The permanent fund, otherwise known as the endowment fund, is an amount of money that's building up that the income from that goes to support the annual fund. We don't actually spend the money in the permanent fund directly, so it's there to support the income from the rest. Polio fund, as it says, is it's probably self-explanatory, but it's to fund the eradication of polio around the world. So within a few years that won't be needed anymore, but we certainly still do need it at the moment and need you to contribute into that one in a big way. And then comes disaster response fund. I'll mention that in a second. So the two big ones, of course, are the annual fund and the polio fund. Those are the ones that you would tend to put money into at the moment. Disaster response, though, is a new one that's been put in recently. The difference is largely it's very focused, so it will be there to build up a pot of funding so that disaster response grants can be applied for. Now, at the moment, we have quite a big demand on that because COVID-19 projects can be funded from there. So districts around the world are applying for disaster response grants, and you can put money into that fund. It can be used directly. So there's no need for the 3-year cycle that I'll touch on in a minute. It's the money goes in and then it can be used all around the world. Of course, other than that, the global grants and district grants, that are the more standard ones that are in place now, can also be used for disaster response. And yes, as I said, contributions can be made directly to that response fund. Now, 3-year investment cycle I've sort of touched on. So if we were to roll the clock back 3 years, we'd be looking at the Rotary year 2017-18. So all the money that was put into the Rotary Foundation then, either into the annual fund or boosting monies into the permanent fund, will have been building up, and that's what we're interested in looking at the moment. So if we roll the clock on, we get 3 years further down the line. The annual fund and permanent fund, of course, swell massively, but probably not as dramatically as they do on the slide. And we have a combination of the monies from the annual fund and the income from the permanent fund, the spendable earnings, producing a pot of money that we have as project funding for this particular year. Now that gets chopped into two. So half of what went in 3 years ago and is now coming out, half of that becomes the World Fund, and that's from every one of the 500 plus districts around the world. That builds up a pot of money there. We then get half the money back to control within each district, and that's called the District Designated Fund. So we actually control the monies that we're going to spend, at least half of what we raised. Now that DDF, you can see in the middle here, there's a little set of mechanics around this. So on the previous slide we were saying 50% of the contributions from 3 years ago. That comes into that DDF, that's the new DDF sort of coming in. Up to half of that can go on a district grant. So projects within the district, we have full control over that amount of money, that pot of money that we will pull back, and we have up to 50% of that DDF from 3 years ago as that grant. The other half can go on global grants, polio donations, so we can make the donations to polio from our DDF. We can transfer funds to another district, or we can donate to the Rotary Peace Centres. Anything left over rolls over into the next years or future years. So of course another thread we have coming in is rollovers and transfers mentioned build up, come into that DDF. So we've got an in and an out there, if you like. Now to put some real numbers around this year, so the 2020-2021 Rotary year, has £23,884, I've actually converted it to pounds this time, coming in as new DDF, which would mean that we can have a district grant that converts into dollars, so it's the numbers slightly mangled, but £11,942 would be half of that. So we have a bit of a special deal on at the moment, so I'll explain in a minute, but that means we can actually boost that up and actually go for an extra large district grant this year, the second of 2 years. So £20,042 is actually available to us as a district grant. Looking at polio, we have a policy of giving 20% of that new DDF to polio. So 4,860 with a little bit of rounding is the contribution we would be making this year to the polio eradication initiative. And there's a very good reason for doing that. Well, there's lots of good reasons for doing that, but there's a very special reason for doing that, in that that World Fund, this is the first example of how we can access that. So we can get a match from that World Fund for anything we give in DDF to polio. So that means out of the World Fund, we get another £4,860 going on top of that. And then anything that Rotary gives to the polio initiative will be matched twice by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that 4,860 gets doubled, and then that number gets tripled, and we end up with £29,160 going to polio, which, considering that's about £5,500 more than we started with, is a very good deal, well worth taking advantage of. So that World Fund match makes a very big difference. So I mentioned the special offer, and it's very much a going because this was a deal we had to be able to use more of our outstanding DDF, if you like, to pump into district grants. And for 2 years, we were able to boost our district grant amounts by $10,000. So looking at those 2 years, we can say, okay, the current district grant would have been $14,743 plus the $10,000, so we get $24,743, and that becomes something roughly, based on the current exchange rate, Rotary anyway, £20,042. Now that's the last time we'll be able to do that, so next year it goes back to the normal level, which in this case would have been that $14,000. So it's a case of either scale things down or possibly even put more into Rotary Foundation in the first place, and then the number would be boosted directly, of course. So that's the end of what I was going to go through for this sort of introduction session, just to sort of whet your appetite for what we've got coming next. In future videos, we are likely to be covering grants, so a really important part of the Rotary Foundation, how we fund projects that are happening out there in the world. Those are based, well, the global grants in particular, based on areas of focus. Now, if you keep up with the news in Rotary terms, a recent announcement made was that there is now a 7th area of focus. So we now have the climate environment as a focus, which is fantastic news, and that will mean we need another one of these wonderful little symbols to be created and add to that list. So look to see how things are going there, and we can explain the district grant application process, going through that process on the diagram there at the moment. We also will look into things like all the peace initiatives that the Rotary Foundation is doing, and there's a great example with the Rotarian Action Group for Peace, fantastic website name of rotarianactiongroupforpeace.org, to see all about what that group is doing, and you can see their Peace Hub map tracking all the initiatives in place all around the world. Of course, the reason we really want to talk about this is, as well as accessing the funds from our charity, to actually encourage people to give to our own charity in terms of Rotary. So what we want to do is increase the new DDF we have each year, because that then influences the size of the district grant we can apply for, which helps us to improve or increase the spending on the projects we want to fund, which of course in turn improves the good we can do in the world. But all of that depends on your support for our charity. To end on another quote from Arch Clumph, the guy that came up with the whole foundation concept in the first place: "We should not live for ourselves alone, but for the joy in doing good for others." So if you want to find out any more about the Rotary Foundation, what it's all about, of course, you can watch this space for more videos like this, but go to that website, foundation.rotary1060.org.uk, and you should see various information change be published there. That's the place we want you to visit. Okay, thank you very much for listening. I hope that's been useful, and say, watch this space for future information.